Joining us here this morning on set is Congressman Louie Gohmert, Republican of Texas, a member of the Judiciary Committee. Thanks for coming back and talking to our viewers.
Certainly. Always look forward to being with you, Greta. Thank you.
Let's start with the debate in South Carolina over the Confederate flag, because it passed in the Senate down there, in the state Senate, and now it's going over to the House side today. And our viewers have been following this debate here on C-SPAN. They can watch it again today, this morning, when they take it up. What's your view on removing the Confederate flag?
I think it's totally up to the state. I understand when people say that it is a symbol that is offensive to them, and you know, that's one of the things we look at making decisions. You know, does the offensiveness overcome any usefulness that it has? I don't think it's necessary to completely remove it off tombstones and things like that. For heaven's sake, it's part of our history. But it's not the reigning flag over South Carolina or anywhere else. But I'm not going to tell South Carolina. I don't think the federal government has any business doing it. But I tell you one thing that I am convinced about after seeing what happened after the shooting, and that is that the people in South Carolina, particularly Charleston, a place that I'm just crazy about, those are good people. And the way they came together, race was not an issue. You had one nutcase that just was violent. But I'm telling you, I don't see how anybody could keep from being touched deeply by the way the family members reacted in love, as Christians are supposed to. I don't know if I could be that loving, but as a Christian, I'm supposed to be. But wow, what a testimony.
There's been some recent news that Texas is considering removing Confederate monuments from around the state. You agree with that? Well,
it depends. I mean, you have to do an assessment, and as I understand, that's what the state officials in Texas are saying. Let's take a look. Some of them may not be accurate. And as an old history major in college, history student every day, I think that's important. Anything that's not accurate or that is offensive more than it is useful to our heritage, then yeah, it's not a problem to remove it. But I have complete faith in the folks in Austin and around Texas. They'll make the right decision. But I think it's a good idea to take a look at it.
There's also been a lot of focus on the Council of Conservative Citizens. It's been called a white nationalist group. Dylan Roof apparently going to their website, citing statistics from their website. The head of that, Errol Holt III, gave you campaign contributions, I understand, in 2012. Do you plan to return them? Some of your colleagues have done so.
No, actually, I'm not returning them to him, but what we're doing is sending them to the church in Charleston. In fact, I've doubled the amount of his contribution. There were only a couple. They weren't very big, but still, double that amount, send it to the church in Charleston where I know it can do some good. I'm allowed to do that, and so that's, I didn't want to send it back to him. Why not go send it to the church where it'll do some good?
Okay. What do you make of this whole debate that's happening in our country and in the South, and particularly in South Carolina after that shooting at that church? And how it's shifted. You know, the Confederate flag was removed. There was a debate back in 2000 to remove it in South Carolina, but now there's this, you know, move it from one place on the Capitol grounds to where it stands now. But now there's this debate of let's take it all the way down and put it in a museum. What do you make about what's going on in our country?
Well, now, as I understand it, the discussion is let's take it out of museums. Let's take it out everywhere. And just like I think it's inappropriate to fail to discuss how outrageous and what an affront to civilization that Hitler was. You can't not discuss part of our heritage. So there are parts of our heritage, slavery, for example. It's an abomination. It did massive damage to this country and to the families and individuals who were enslaved. But you don't not them because you can't grow better unless you look at warts and all of your heritage. But as you look at our heritage, and you know, we had an awakening in the early 1700s, a spiritual Christian revival, that many say that's what led to churches coming out and helping lead the charge for the revolution. And then a second great awakening that drove churches to push for an end to slavery. I know there were some on the fringe that supported it, but that was certainly not a very Christ-like way to go. And then you have an ordained Christian minister named Martin Luther King Jr. that helped, some say, well, he helped African Americans. No, he didn't. He helped everybody in America. I was a little white kid in East Texas, and because of his work and what he gave his life for, I was able to grow up treating brothers and sisters like brothers and sisters. So we've seen that at play throughout our history. Nothing is gained by ignoring the bad parts of history. And of course, you know, the discussion that many are having in the South and in Texas and South Carolina is, to many who didn't, most of them didn't have slaves, it was about the federal government not telling our state what we can or can't do about states' rights. But it's kind of hard to separate the states' rights argument from the fact that slavery was the biggest element of that states' rights. And, you know, if you look at the history of Abraham Lincoln, and Steve Mansfield, historian, has a great book on Lincoln's struggle with God and his evolution to the point of becoming president. But I talked to historians, passed away now, but Professor Rufus Fears from Oklahoma, and I just love that guy. He was such a historian. But he was telling me that Lincoln believed that for a guy that looked like him and sounded like him to be elected president, God had to be in it, and that he had a purpose, and that was to end slavery. And that originally he believed he was supposed to immediately start to end slavery. And he didn't do that. Of course, states started seceding. So he felt like, okay, I'll hold the Union together, and then once I've held it together, then I'll end slavery. And anyway, Dr. Fears said that after his and Mary's first son died, or I mean the first one of their sons to pass, had died, Lincoln blamed himself. He felt like, and I'm not sure this is right, but he felt like God was punishing him for not immediately moving to end slavery. And that drove him to push for the things he started moving on later in his presidency. But I don't know if God was punishing him for not immediately trying to end slavery, but it does give you a glimpse into the difficulty that Lincoln was encountering internally.
Talk about this a little bit, because here's the Washington Post editorial recently, how Texas is whitewashing Civil War history. And they write this, that this fall, Texas schools...
That's funny coming from the Washington Post. They watch a lot of history.
This fall, Texas schools will teach students that Moses played a bigger role in inspiring the Constitution than slavery did in starting the Civil War. The Lone Star State's new social studies textbooks, deliberately written to play down slavery's role in Southern history, do not threaten only Texas, they write. They pose a danger to school children all over the country.
Well, I'm not sure that's accurate in every state, but from our study of Texas history, slavery was not a big deal in Texas. It was something that just overwhelmed Texas. And so for some states, slavery was what the Civil War was all about. But in Texas, it was more of a states' rights issue. And the Washington Post, I'm sure it's just their ignorance about the Bible and about our history, but it wasn't as much Moses as it was teachings through the Bible and how God divided, we get to three branches. You had judges, you had the executive and the kingship, and then you had those who made the law. And often that was rolled into one person, but they saw that as three separate, distinct roles of government, and we ended up with three branches arising out of that. But if you come into the House chamber, you know, there are side profiles of all the greatest lawgivers in the history of man, as was thought at the time it was done. The only one with a full face is Moses. And that's because at one time he was thought to be the greatest lawgiver of all time. He had 10 good commandments. Now, I guess the Supreme Court would say, well, maybe 5 or 6 of them are pretty good. But if I was listening to oral arguments, I was licensed to practice law before the Supreme Court, but I was listening to arguments about whether or not Texas could keep the statue on our state capitol grounds for the 10 Commandments. And they were arguing back and forth about the symbol and all this. And I looked up to my right on that marble wall. You got Moses inscribed on the wall looking down with the 10 Commandments. And I thought, what kind of surrealistic world am I living in? They're talking about whether Texas can keep a monument dedicated to it. And of course, Moses, important thing, that they inscribed him in the wall. Now, I didn't know until I saw, and C-SPAN may have played a role in this, but a documentary about the Supreme Court in the last few years that, of course, Taft got the money appropriated for the separate building for the Supreme Court. When they first opened it in 1935, the judges were appalled. They said, they were taken through, and they said, judges should not have a palace. This is a palace. And some of the judges for a long time did not move in because it was a palace. And I don't know if you're aware, but they're okay with the palace now. But back in 1935, they were concerned about it.
Well, indeed, C-SPAN did do a documentary about the Supreme Court, so our viewers can go to our website. Yeah. So that's one debate, the Civil War and Confederate flag. We want to talk to you, but also we're going to have you weigh in on Supreme Court decisions recently and immigration debate as well. But I do have to get some calls in here. So let's go to Mike in Pennsylvania, an independent. Mike, good morning to you. Go ahead.
Hi, Mike.
I was wondering if the representative would explain to the fearful people in Texas that the federal government is not going to be invading Texas. Thank you.
Oh, well, I guess he's talking about Operation Jade Helm. Now, there's some people that have ascribed things to me that I didn't say, and that's not unusual. I mean, I'm still called a birther, and I've never been a birther. I signed onto a bill that Bill Posey did back in 2009 that said, hey, before the next election, any future election, whoever's running should prove that they're qualified, they're American citizen as required, and that they're 35. But I thought that was a good idea. I still think it is, so that we don't have those disputes after people are elected president. But I'm called a birther. Now, I'm accused of saying we're afraid the federal government's going to invade and take over Texas. That what I find incredibly offensive is that in this Jade Helm exercise, I've never seen this before, but a map was provided that showed the states, including Texas. Texas was red, it was considered hostile. Utah, another very conservative state, was considered hostile. The very conservative area in Southern California was considered hostile. I mean, I participated in military games, I've helped plan them, and was in the Army for 4 years at Fort Benning. I've seen lots of games, but I've never seen real names used like that, and especially not in the United States. It's an affront. It's an offense. I mean, for heaven's sake, back in the late 70s, when we were thinking we may be going into Iran, war games didn't use the name Iran. We made up names. So I just found that extremely offensive, that this administration or this commander-in-chief would say, Texas is hostile, we got to take it back over. That is just so wrong. But there have been military games going on around the country for decades. That's not as much a concern as the affront of naming Texas and Utah as a place that had to be recaptured.
Okay, we'll go to Oxford, Maine. Jim, a Republican.
Good morning.
Morning.
Good morning.
Thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
Assuming that South Carolina wins and they take down that Confederate flag, what would be everybody's reaction if all the Indian tribes around the country insisted that we take down the American flag? If anybody's got a grievance, I think those are the people that really have a grievance.
And did he say the Mexican arguing that the American flag be taken down?
No, that Native Americans.
Native Americans argue that. Well, that's an interesting point. I don't see that happening, except that in some places around the country, that battle has been fought verbally. Gee, we've got to take down the American flag. Some people think it's an affront. People have already alleged that, and the American flag needs to stand. As long as this is the United States of America, that American flag needs to stand and wave proudly. Too many have given their lives trying to make that happen. And, you know, of course, Native American, that's another issue we ought to be looking more into. I'm on the committee with jurisdiction, and I hope we see better ways that Native Americans are treated. Natural
Resources Committee you're referring to?
Yes, right.
Okay. Congressman Gohmert, a member of the Natural Resources Committee, as well as the Judiciary panel, Dan in Texas, an independent. Hi, Dan.
Hey, Dan.
Hey, y'all. Good morning.
Morning.
Good morning.
I've got a question for Representative. I'm a Vietnam vet.
Thank you for your service.
Thank you, sir. My question is, does he believe that we're trying to do away with our so-called history that's made this country as great as it is today? And the stuff that our Supreme Court is doing, I think they're going against our forefathers' rights, that they fought for this country to make this country so great. And they're getting away from God's law, and they're trying to make their own laws replace God's law. And what does he think that on this issue?
Well, thank you for that question. And yes, I think the Supreme Court, not all of them, but some of them have been violating their oaths of office, and they're not concerned as much about the Constitution as they are looking good in the editorial page of the Washington Post and New York Times, and they've done massive amounts. I mean, if you look at the decision, and I've got it here on Obamacare that they've done in the last 2 weeks, I thought Justice Scalia said it well. He said, words no longer have meaning if an exchange that's not established by a state is, quote, established by the state. I mean, the court was just making stuff up, rewriting the legislation. It was an outrage what they did. And so it's kind of hard to take Justice Roberts the next day, you know, coming down on the majority on Friday when he was part of a ridiculous majority. But when it comes to the decision on marriage, look, I know that a lot of people don't believe the Bible like I do. And if you think Moses was crazy when he said a man shall leave his mother and father, woman leave her home, the two will become one flesh, and that's a marriage, or you think Jesus was crazy, a madman, as some said, when he repeated that as the law on marriage, and what he added was, what God's joined together, let no man separate. But if you took 4 couples, men and women, couple, man and wife, and you put those 4 couples on an island that had everything needed to survive, and then you took 4 couples of men, maybe we could have a big government survey or study, spend billions of dollars to study this, put 4 couples of men on another island with all they need to survive, and then another island, 4 couples of women with all they need to survive, and come back in 200 years and see, if you don't believe in God at all, see what nature has done, which group, which civilization has survived and which has ended. And I think that would tell us, even if you don't believe in God, what nature dictates should be a marriage, a building block. And people that have loved individuals from the same sex and been prohibited from seeing them in the hospital, I mean, those kind of things we should fix. If you love somebody and they love you, you ought to be able to see them in the hospital. You ought to be able to leave them property. There are a lot of things we could fix without destroying the building block. But in the case of marriage, 2 of our justices, Kagan and Ginsburg, had presided over same-sex marriage. So there was no question they believed it was constitutional. That means they were disqualified. The law, 28 U.S.C. 455, says any justice, judge, or magistrate of the United States shall disqualify, not maybe, shall disqualify in any proceeding which impartiality might reasonably be questioned. We had two justices that were totally disqualified. They acted illegally. They violated the Constitution. That's an illegitimate and improper decision. And when the highest court in the land has two judges that are that condescending and that willing to violate the law in order to impose their unelected will on the American people, then God help us, we're in a lot of trouble. And I think that's where we are.
Your reaction to the front page of the Washington Times this morning. Same-sex marriage ruling is giving gun groups silver lining. They write this, that they have argued that the protections of the 14th Amendment the court cited in the gay marriage case, striking down state bans on same-sex marriage, could translate to loosened restrictions for concealed carry licenses, potentially forcing states that don't recognize concealed carry permits issued in other states to do so.
Well, Greta, I know that's trying to put a silver lining on that abominable decision, but what the writers at the Washington Times don't realize is how the Supreme Court has no problem whatsoever being completely contradictory. If they were a consistent court and used the same logic, used precedent, and followed that, then that would be a good point. But the trouble with this Supreme Court, they won't even follow their own precedent. I mean, for heaven's sake, you look at the DOMA case. They said members of Congress have standing because they passed the law, they got it passed, it was theirs. But marriage is an issue for the states. Federal government has no role whatsoever in it. Well, that should have been enough to keep them from getting involved in the same-sex marriage case, but it didn't because they're completely hypocritical. But in that same set of cases, they also ruled on a California case where people voted on it, got it passed, it was a referendum, and they said those people didn't have standing. Same situation as the members of Congress were on DOMA, yet they said they didn't have standing. Or look at the decision on Obamacare originally. At page 15, Justice Roberts, writing for the majority, says, look, this is not a this is not a tax, it's a penalty, because if it were a tax, then the plaintiffs wouldn't have standing and we wouldn't have jurisdiction. Congress called it a penalty. Clearly it's a penalty and not a tax, and since it's not a tax, we have jurisdiction, plaintiffs have standing. And then he goes for 40 pages or so, and then he comes out and said, now, since this is really a tax and not a penalty, it's constitutional. I mean, they didn't mind being massive hypocrites in the same decision. I mean, just a few dozen pages apart. So the Washington Times makes a good point if this were a consistent court, but they've gotten so far away from the Constitution and come unanchored from anything we can rely on.
Back to calls. Ron in Bradenton, Florida, Democrat. Hi, Ron.
Hello, Ron.
Good morning, Greta. You're looking good again this morning.
She looked like she got a tan, didn't she? I mean, yeah.
Congressman,
yes.
Let's start out with your comment about the states and the Nazis. I don't remember us allowing the Nazis to put up any kind of flags or any kind of remembrance or stones for all the good battles and everything that they did good for their fights.
Well,
a couple more comments. If you would have taken those 55 or 60 different, take that health care out of there and instead of repealing it, replaced it 55 times out of 55 times, you might have come up with one good plan that the president could have okayed, and then you wouldn't have had that good Supreme Court to come in and take care of your problem. They're doing a good job, and I'm a Christian. I've read the Bible, and I would never stone my children because they didn't take and follow my rules. Read the Bible. God says to take him.
Okay. All right, Ron.
Yeah, and thank you. And I do read the Bible every day, and I'm glad that he reads it time to time. But yeah, that's what Jesus brought us. But if you will read what he said in Matthew 5, it was a crime to say raka about someone. He said if you say raka to somebody, then you'll answer the courts. If you look at Romans 13, it makes very clear. The government's supposed to be an encouragement to do good, but if you do evil, be afraid, because God doesn't give the government the sword in vain. So if you commit a capital crime, then capital punishment, it can be and is an appropriate punishment. But everybody misunderstand, and apparently the caller did, about my mentioning the Nazis. The point I was making, whether you agree or disagree with something that's happened in the past, you don't just take it out of the history books like Stalin did and eliminate it altogether. And my friend that called in obviously is not aware, but there was a time, even as abominable as the Nazi flag was, it was allowed in some places in the United States, not because nearly everybody wasn't offended, we were, but because this is America and there's freedom here, or there used to be. And so, but I was not comparing the Confederacy to Nazi Germany. I was pointing out you don't eliminate parts of your history you don't like altogether. But anyway, we did have a time in this country, most of our history, when people were quoting, usually attributable to Voltaire, I disagree with what you say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it. Now, we have disregarded that. That was often cited during the Revolution. Now it's, I disagree with what you say, I'm going to get you fired, I'm going to have everybody hating your family. You think people don't go after my family because they disagree with me? This is a mean-spirited time in America, and I think we could all do better if we do like our caller does time to time and read the Bible.
Cedar Hill, Texas. Patty, on our line for Republicans, you're on the air.
Hi, Patty.
Yes, hello, Representative Gohmert. I just want to say thank you. I just want to tell you how much I really appreciate you for standing up for what's right, for standing up for biblical principle. I mean, it's rare that you find people who claim to be Christians that are willing to stand up and even mention the name of Jesus. And it's so refreshing to do that. I myself am a follower of Christ. I would say Christians, but a lot of times people misunderstand the word Christian, and they're very liberal about it, and they feel like as a Christian they can do anything against the Word of God. But I would like to say thank you so much, and that I want to pray for you, your family, and the few Republicans that call themselves Christian who are willing to stand. I can't find that many, but when I do find one, I want to let you know how much I really, really appreciate it.
Okay, Patty. All right, Congressman?
Patty, good night. I wish we were in the same room so I could hug your neck. Maybe someday I'll get a chance to do that. Thank you. And if you're going to pray for me, I don't need prayers for courage. Sometimes I got too much, but I need prayers for wisdom and discernment. That's my shortcoming. And
what did you make of the Pope recently saying that the world needs to act on climate change, and said that God will judge those on how they leave the earth?
And he, he's the Pope. The trouble is, he has been persuaded that climate change is something that's dramatically affecting the planet right now. He's bought into all this. And I have nothing but the utmost respect. I thank God for the Catholic Church. I thank God for the stances of prior popes and this pope. But we have had popes that made enormous mistakes that were influenced by the world around them. But if he'll just really objectively look at the data and see that the world is really not warming, and that's why supporters of global warming had to change the name to climate change, because it was going back and forth. But I don't see it so much as a problem. Where I live in East Texas, we have climate change. I totally believe that. I know that to be a fact. In fact, we have it 4 times a year. So,
you said that the Pope has been persuaded by people. By whom?
By the massive onslaught of media trying to convince the world that climate change is our leading problem. I mean, the president said it repeatedly. And I think it's wonderful if the Pope listens to the words of a U.S. president. That's a good thing. But, you know, so many places do not even allow an opposing viewpoint. Conferences don't allow an opposing viewpoint. Since when, well, that's a rhetorical question. I was going to say, since when does science not allow opposing viewpoints? Well, they didn't allow Galileo to make an opposing viewpoint. There were a lot of accurate opposing viewpoints that weren't allowed at the time that were later allowed to come in, and people wondered, how in the world did that whole group of educated people come to the wrong conclusion? So climate change, it happens, it will always happen. And there's cycles. I remember reading a headline on one of the big national magazines that we were at the beginning of the new ice age back in the 70s, and I thought, the world does not end with an ice age. Well, this is just the beginning. It's a long way off. But they were wrong then, and I think there'll be another cycle to come.
Canton, North Carolina. Terry, on our line for Republicans. You're on the air with the Congressman. Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Gohmert. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning.
As a Southern man, I want to say something about the flag. I believe it's heritage, not hate, but I don't think it should be on top of the State House. But my big beef is the border. Democrats in Chicago. Chicago is the distribution hub for billions and billions of tons of heroin, methamphetamines, marijuana. They want to blame guns in Chicago for everybody killing each other. But Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, and the Democrats had blood on their hands. Those children died because of gang wars and people killing each other over drugs.
Okay, we'll talk about drug policy in this country.
Yeah, well, and I appreciate this point about the border. I didn't really get a fluid line of the whole reasoning there, but the border is an issue, and we had these numbers in from ICE. In fiscal year 2014, ICE released 30,558 convicted criminal aliens in 2014. They had been convicted of 79,059 crimes, including 175 homicides, 373 sexual assaults, 186 kidnappings, and 14,014 impaired driving offenses. As of the end of March, ICE has released another 10,246 criminal aliens. This is a massive problem, and if we're going to keep our oath, we have got to force the southern border to be protected. And when it comes to gangs, as a felony judge in a former life, let me tell you, I had a gang member convicted of murder. He was the head of his gang, and against his lawyer's wishes, he testified on the sentencing phase. And he said, look, everybody's always trashing gangs. He said, I got no father, hardly ever seen my mother. My gang is my family, and I'm sick of people trashing it. So, you know, it got me to thinking, really, we talk about guns and drugs, but isn't a bigger problem the fact that a gang leader like that ended up murdering someone? Isn't it a real tragedy that we have broken up the family the way we have? Great Society meant well, but when you start paying people for every child they can have out of wedlock, then you will go as we have, from under 7% single moms to heading over 40, heading toward 50% single moms. And that was his case. His mom wasn't able to spend time with him. And so you look at the formulation of gangs and the impact they've had. You look at people going over to ICE. Some of them come from good homes, but some of them are just looking for a family because we've destroyed so much of the family here in America. I think that gets more to the root of the issue.
Well, lots more to talk on that. You'll have to come back another time. We're all out today. Thank you, Congressman. Appreciate it.
I love being with you. Thank you so much. Well, and you're always so fair. I'm sure there are a lot of things I said you don't agree with, but you're always fair, and I greatly appreciate that.
Well, we appreciate you coming on and talking to our viewers. So
Anytime.
Come back. All right.
Anytime.
Coming up next, we're